You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Earlier this month, Prime Minister David Cameron said it was mission accomplished in Afghanistan and told troops there that they could return home with their heads held high. He said the task had been to create a basic level of security to prevent the country from becoming a haven for terror. But his comments have been greeted with scepticism. Al-Qaeda has long been vanquished in Afghanistan, but its most important area of activity is now further west, in Syria, Iraq and parts of Africa. Meanwhile, the Taliban remains a redoubtable force. Opium production has flourished, and it's not yet clear whether any achievements in security, as well as in the drive to install democracy, functioning institutions and improved conditions for women, will prove sustainable after foreign troops pull out of the country next year. So, was Mr. Cameron right? Or has the 12-year Western military occupation of Afghanistan instead failed to achieve its goals? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Professor Anatol Lieven of the War Studies Department at King's College London and author of the book Pakistan, A Hard Country. And on the line we have Colonel Richard Kemp, who was commander of British troops in Afghanistan in 2003 and is now a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and in Afghanistan, Daoud Sultanzoy, a former member of the Afghan parliament and a candidate for the presidency at next year's elections. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Daoud Sultanzoy, I want to start with you. What's the view in Afghanistan of Mr. Cameron's declaration of mission accomplished?
Well, we understand the political need for the consumption of this kind of a statement. Naturally, you can see a glass half full or half empty, but the problem with Afghanistan's endeavor, the international community's involvement in Afghanistan, is that from the very beginning, from the Bonn process, everything started on a reactive mode. And the international community, including Britain and the United States, never became proactive regarding Afghanistan. And we always patched things as we went. Our goals shifted, our strategies shifted. We never held the Afghan government responsible. We never held them accountable. While on one hand, we wanted to say that Afghanistan is a free country and the government has to find its own way. On the other hand, the international community was at the helm of the most corrupt government in the world and kept feeding it, and this government and this leadership has acted as a spoiled child of the international community and getting away with it.
All right, so a mixed picture there. Colonel Richard Kemp, I want to bring you in here. From a military point of view, is Cameron right that basic stability in Afghanistan has been achieved?
Can I just say I agree with almost every word that Daoud Sultanzoy just said there. I think he's completely right, particularly about the level of corruption and the competence of the Afghan government and the indulgence that the West has made in it, and also about the continuously changing strategic goals and aims of the West. But in answer to your question, I believe militarily our forces and other NATO forces in Afghanistan have made some very major achievements. They have killed a large number of extremists who certainly threatened the stability of Afghanistan, and in many cases would undoubtedly have gone on to threaten terrorist attacks against the West and around the world. I have no doubt whatever about that. And by stopping so many of them, I think that they have helped to protect the Western world, as well as, to an extent, Afghanistan. I also think that they've been successful in preventing Afghanistan again from becoming a base for terrorism from which the West can be threatened. And I recognize that does not mean that Afghanistan has been and is now a secure country which enjoys any measure of peace. But it has achieved that objective, which I think was the overwhelming objective of the West. And thirdly, I think that military forces' presence in Afghanistan has significantly contributed to the effective destruction of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. There's still remnants of them there, but they have been prevented from operating freely, and they've been effectively put on the run to a large extent by intelligence networks, support infrastructures, and other facilitation that's been possible only by having troops in Afghanistan. And yes, I recognize the point you made in your introduction that the Al-Qaeda operation is expanding elsewhere in the world, but it's like any military force, any terrorist organization. You can't just say we will defeat them in one place and they won't spring up somewhere else. Of course, they may well do, and then you have to pursue them where they go.
Thank you. Professor Anatol Lieven, broadly, what do you make of Mr. Cameron's comments? Is he right that militarily something has been achieved, and is that even the most important criterion by which we take stock of the situation in Afghanistan?
Well, a British Prime Minister obviously has to pay tribute to British troops. It would be extremely unnatural, not to say dishonourable, if he didn't do so. And I think what he could have said is that British soldiers in Afghanistan have upheld, to use a very old-fashioned phrase, the honour of British arms. They have done their duty bravely, and in disciplined fashion, and of course have made a greater contribution than any other country except the United States. Beyond that, however, I think it's fairly clear that we've only achieved some of the admittedly somewhat megalomaniac aims that we set out 12 years ago. The other problem is that everything, or almost everything, that we have achieved and set up in Afghanistan depends on the continuation of Western funding. The Afghan state raises only 1/10 of its own revenue, 1/10. The entire security budget of the Afghan National Army and Police are paid for by the United States. The entire development budget is paid for by different Western countries. Which means, of course, that, which was, by the way, equally true of the state left behind by the Soviet Union in 1989. It survived actually pretty well, but only as long as the subsidies continued to flow. Well, this, of course, raises the question, how long is the US Congress going to be prepared to pay $4 billion a year to support the Afghan National Army? If it doesn't, then it's game over.
We're joined now in the studio by Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, who is a research associate at the Oxford University Centre for International Studies. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Ishtiaq. I just want to ask you, David Cameron said earlier this month that British forces had achieved their mission, had accomplished their mission in Afghanistan, a point of view which has been greeted by some scepticism. Mm-hmm. What do you make of what he said?
Well, it is, of course, a premature statement. It reminds us of the similar remarks, made by President Bush, 10 years ago. Because a lot remains to be done in Afghanistan. There are a lot of uncertainties as we speak now. Elections are ahead. What will be the outcome? Talks with the Taliban have not started. And there are legitimate fears in the region that we might see the revival of the similar kind of civil war that took place back in the 90s that led to the creation of Taliban, Al-Qaeda coming in, and all those anarchy in that place and its implications for the region.
Dawood Sultanzai, in Afghanistan, we've heard here about the uncertainty for the future, particularly regarding the budget, ultimately the funding of the Afghan state. What do you make of this? How big is the risk that Afghanistan will slip into anarchy if international troops leave and if international money stops flowing?
I think no matter what we say about risks, let's make sure we don't depict a completely hopeless picture, because in every aspect of our comment, when we see a dark cloud overhead, there's also an exit. And I think the exit in this case is the election. If the international community does not hide from its own responsibilities for making sure that there's a transparent election, and if the international community does not, again, allow their spoiled child to behave badly and rig the election, and when the new government comes as a result of a good election, just in corruption alone, we will save $4 billion a year. So the fact that Afghan government is not financially capable of standing on its own feet is true, but also the fact is that there's so much waste and corruption, and if we make sure that the hope is revived in the Afghan population and the hope is revived in the international community, Afghanistan is able to offer hope not only for its own people and for the region, but also for the international community's investment. So we should look at the brighter side also. It all hinges on a very good election that will instill hope and bring confidence back into the population that has been lacking. This self-confidence, let's not underestimate that self-confidence in nations that are at war or in conflict is the most important propelling agent. And this has been lacking in Afghanistan because of the fact that this government and bystanding international community has allowed this government to perpetrate what they have done. And I think there's a lot of hope ahead of us, and I'm sure there's a change coming in Pakistan, India and Pakistan's relation, Iran's new softness, and the possibility of a good election can bring hope and can create a situation where we can start with a clean slate. And if the election is stolen again, and if the election depletes the people from the very little confidence that exists in them, then no matter how many billions of dollars the United States and the rest of the world pours into Afghanistan, it will be going into a black hole, and it will be the continuation of the past 12 years.
And what role do you see for the Taliban amid all this, amid the election and amid the hopes for a progressive future?
The Taliban's and the Hizb Islami Ekmetiar's role in the election can be directed to a large extent by Pakistan, by at least some circles in Pakistan, not necessarily all of them in the government, also in the cleric groups and also in the civil society where they can play a role. The religious aspects of the civil society can play a role. At the same time, one has to say that Pakistan's approach towards the Afghan election should be based on their new calculations for a stable Afghanistan. And I think the peace talks and the Taliban's behaviors, they all depend on the future election. One thing that has happened in the past few years has been the void that the performance of the government has created, and the gulf of the distance between the people of Afghanistan and its government has made the Taliban look bigger in this void than they really were. Pakistan knows this, Afghanistan knows this, and Iran knows this. And ironically and sadly, war and conflict has been a very good cover for the corrupt government in Afghanistan. This government doesn't want peace. This government doesn't have the tools to bring peace, and they're hiding behind war. They're using war and conflict as an excuse for their looting and for their poor performance in terms of bringing rule of law and good governance. The Taliban's performance has also been very, very interesting. While this government has been weakening, Taliban have looked larger than they are. While they cannot offer anything as solutions for the future of Afghanistan, all they have is a claim for Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan. And if we are optimistic, and when we calculate the number of Taliban and their followers, they may not even be close to 500,000 people. The rest of the people are bystanders. They're not siding with the Taliban, nor they're siding with the government of Afghanistan. They're the victims of two sides. And we have to win those people so we can really make sure that Taliban are where they are, and the Taliban will be isolated, and then the Taliban will realize that they have to become part of the peace, not against peace.
Colonel Richard Kemp, do you recognise this description of the Taliban, that they've been sort of puffed up into a kind of mega bogeyman to obscure deeper problems in Afghanistan, or are they a serious factor in it for any kind of future arrangement in the country?
I think there is an element of correctness in what Daud Sultanzai says. Obviously, it is in the interests of the current government, corrupt as it is, to make whatever it can for its own political gain of the Taliban. But I think the reality is the Taliban is a very potent insurgent force, which has, let's face it, has posed immense challenges to the might of the United States of America, Great Britain, and the rest of NATO, not to mention the Afghanistan government itself. And I think one of the areas that we have dramatically failed in Afghanistan is to prevent Pakistan from providing the support to the Taliban that's enabled the Taliban to be as powerful and effective as it has been and continues to be. And I think I'm not suggesting, because of the extremely complex and difficult nature of the country of Pakistan and its government, that it would have been possible to stop them, but it is certainly a failure. They have, the Pakistan government, elements certainly of the Pakistan government, have enabled the Taliban to be as powerful as it has been.
Yes, I want to come to Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed on that in a second, but I just want to ask, the Taliban do have an office in Qatar. We have heard rumblings about direct negotiations with the Americans. Do you know what stage they are at, and how important is it that there is some kind of a deal in that respect?
I think for Western forces, and possibly for the Afghan government as well, but certainly for the Western governments rather than Western forces, it would be highly convenient to have a deal with the Taliban, and it would contribute to the idea of NATO and the West withdrawing with honour from Afghanistan. But I'm very sceptical about the reality of that. I think the Taliban is so diametrically opposed to the objectives of the West that I think it's highly unlikely there will be any significant accommodation. Certainly an accommodation that lasts for very long at all with the West. I think there's more hope on the part of Western governments and perhaps some smoke and mirrors and exploitation by the Taliban, and perhaps building some expectations. But I don't think in reality the Taliban have any desire or intent to come to an accommodation.
Do you really think that it would be a question of honour to do a deal with the Taliban, because they've been presented as the enemy that international forces have been kind of fighting for the last decade and plus?
Yeah, well, as I agree, I completely understand what you're saying, and I agree with it. But I think that Western governments, the US and the British government in particular, would see it as an honourable way out, in the same way as, speaking as a Brit, that we kind of proclaim the success of our negotiations with the IRA, which effectively helped to end the terrorist campaign in Northern Ireland. And I think we hold that up as an example of a way in which we could certainly say, yes, well, we're leaving Afghanistan, but we've made the Taliban have come to the conference table, and so we're not leaving it in a state of war. I think that would be a desirable objective for Western governments, but I don't think it's going to happen.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing whether British Prime Minister David Cameron was right to declare mission accomplished in Afghanistan. With me in the studio are Professor Anatol Lieven, who is from the War Studies Department of King's College London and is author of the book Pakistan, A Hard Country, and Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed from the Oxford University Centre for International Studies. And on the line we have Colonel Richard Kemp, who was commander of British troops in Afghanistan in 2003 and is now a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and in Afghanistan, Daoud Sultanzoy, a former member of the Afghan parliament and a presidential candidate at next year's elections. Anatol Lieven, you were in Afghanistan earlier this year. You visited Kabul and also Helmand. Just describe briefly the varying presence of the Taliban in the minds of people in those two places.
Well, in Kabul, people are focused above all on next year's elections and what happens. I cannot say that among the people I talked to, there was any great hope that these elections will be free and fair and transparent in a Western sense. The serious discussion was more whether the result will be accepted by the political establishment as a whole, including by the losers. Also, a very important issue is whether the Pashtun population in Afghanistan would accept a non-Pashtun, or somebody seen as a non-Pashtun, Dr. Abdullah, as president. Karzai is bound to try to, shall we say, euphemistically manage these elections as far as he can. And of course, given the appalling risks, if there is a breakdown, if in fact the losers refuse to accept the result, I can have some sympathy with the idea that, a free and fair election isn't everything. Avoiding a new kind of civil war in Afghanistan is also very important. Now, I think that there is a reasonably good chance that actually the results of the elections will be accepted by, shall we say, the people who we've described up to now as being on our side in Afghanistan, if only on the immortal principle that if they don't hang together, they're likely to hang separately at the hands of the Taliban. So they may pull themselves together over that. Down in Helmand, of course, the threat of the Taliban seems much more imminent, because this is obviously one of their heartlands. This is Pashtun territory. And down there, I would say that there is no chance whatsoever of actually crushing the Taliban by now. In fact, the Afghan National Army is already pulling back from outlying positions as Western support is diminished. And so down there, it would appear that one is really looking at either essentially an unending civil war, possibly a low-level civil war in which the government holds the main urban centres and the Taliban controls much of the countryside, which is, of course, precisely the situation after the Soviets withdrew, or indeed in the last years of the Soviet presence as well, or a peace settlement. When on the possibility of a peace settlement, Colonel Kemp is absolutely right. I mean, country after country, not just Britain, but France in the past, the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, begin by declaring that people are terrorists, that we can never talk to them, and end up, of course, by talking to them. I am somewhat more optimistic, but only to a very limited degree, because I have talked to people close to the Taliban, and there is a certain trend of opinion in the Taliban, we don't know how strong it is, which recognises that they cannot in fact conquer the whole country, that the forces arrayed against them are too strong, that even if we do in fact end our support, the Russians, the Iranians, the Indians will back the anti-Taliban forces. And while that might allow the Taliban to sweep the Pashtun areas, as they did in the 1990s, they could never conquer the other parts of the country. Well, at that point, it does actually make sense to seek a peace settlement, unless you are prepared to look at the partition of Afghanistan, which of course nobody actually wants, including the Taliban. So I think there is a certain room there, but a terrible threat, which is already undermining that, is the danger of a proxy war between India and Pakistan, which is to a considerable degree already happening. I mean, Pakistan is using the Haqqani network in particular to attack Indian targets in Afghanistan. India is using Afghanistan as a base to support Baloch rebels against Pakistan. And incidentally, Mr. Sultanjoy was exactly correct in saying that, of course, the Afghan Taliban have bases in Pakistan. It must be said with the support of the local Pashtun population in Pakistan, not just the state. But then it's also true that the leader of the Pakistani Taliban is based in Afghanistan, in Kunar. So, the point is that the Durand Line, the frontier that we, the British, drew between Afghanistan and Pakistan, has never really been a frontier on the ground because, of course, it runs through the middle of the same Pashtun tribe. So what you have is, by now, a Pashtun area of discontent with different outside forces fishing in it for advantage, and in the process, of course, fueling this civil war.
Ishtiaq Ahmed, sorry for the delay there. Yes, the Pakistani angle vis-a-vis the Taliban. The Taliban have also created vast problems in Pakistan itself. What steps are being taken there, and are they proving effective? And unless there is some kind of serious initiative against the against the Taliban in Pakistan, can they ever be dealt with in Afghanistan, do you think?
Well, there are two Taliban we are talking about here. One is Afghan Taliban, and then there are Pakistani Taliban. And Anatol was right in saying, Pakistan was seeking strategic depth in the 90s and beyond. And that is why it was helping a host of groups, including the Afghan Taliban. But now somehow there is a role reversal, that Pakistani Taliban leadership, is present in Afghanistan areas, in Nuristan, the Maulvi Fazlullah. But recently it is reported that he has returned to the country. So there are now growing fears in the Pakistani establishment as well, that the sort of games that they were playing, all these couple of decades with the Afghans, is coming back to haunt them. And about Pakistan's role in Afghanistan, I think it was important before in terms of peace settlement. It is still important. until and unless, Pakistan prevails, whatever influence it has on the Afghan Taliban leadership, most of it is based in Pakistan itself, peace process cannot move credibly forward. What we have seen are some meaningful steps taken by the Pakistanis in the last 1 year or so, but somehow, there is some kind of a reluctance, and this is primarily because of the trust deficit that exists, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or particularly with the Karzai government. And then the same factor that somehow, if this relationship is only confined to issues concerning these ties, then it is, able to overcome. But each time, this India-Pakistan, which is a much longer, deeper rivalry, comes in to, cast its dark shadow over political settlement of Afghanistan and Pakistan's role in it.
All right, Dawood Sultanzoy, I want to ask you about the prospects for a deal between Hamid Karzai, who is in power at the moment, and the Americans, who appear to be keen to maintain a troop presence in Afghanistan until the year 2024, and may perhaps make the delivery of aid money conditional upon that. What's your view? Is that a good idea? Should Karzai sign that deal, or would it be counterproductive?
I see. If I may interject, I think one of the things that should happen, in my opinion, is what happened in Bonn in the zeal to calm the public and bring confidence in the United States and European public opinion. The international community made a deal, and they divided Afghanistan as a war trophy among those who had been defeated by the Taliban a few years earlier, and that is still going on. Unless we change that with a new government and bring some kind of equilibrium where the Taliban and Hizb Islami portions can see themselves in the future government, I don't think any peace talks will produce anything. And I think also the Pakistani side and the Indians and the Iranians, even from then, they started a quasi-proxy war in Afghanistan, which is still going on under the nose of the international community, under the nose of NATO. So these are all interrelated, and we need to pay attention to that. And Mr. Karzai is the product of those deals. So Mr. Karzai is going to make sure he will try to push the United States and the Western allies, because he has been getting away with it, to as far as he can, so he can get some concessions for a free passage from after this election into his civilian life for himself and for his family and for his deputies and for some looters of Northern Alliance and his own allies from the South. This is what he's doing, and the people of Afghanistan are reading his hands, and it's up to the United States and the international community to call his bluff. I think the United States and the people of Afghanistan, the British, all of us, all the people who are involved, they have citizens who have died. They have citizens who have sacrificed themselves. We cannot forget that. They have come here to help.
Okay, but would it be better for American troops to remain in the country or not, in your opinion?
I think the United States and the international community has an obligation to stabilize Afghanistan. We paid dearly during the Cold War, during the war against terror, and also the proxy wars in between. It is the international community's responsibility to stabilize this country. So a premature departure from this country will not only exacerbate our situation, but it will send droves and droves of refugees who would become extremists into Europe, to your streets in London and Paris and Berlin. And I don't think you should allow that to happen. We should create a situation for them to live in their own country under a lawful government, under a government that can provide them services and govern properly.
So the troops should stay, in your opinion. The troops should stay. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I said. They need to stay. That's their obligation. They need to stabilize this country.
Colonel Richard Kemp, do you agree with that, or do you think their presence could be counterproductive because, of course, they might attract military attack by people who simply don't want foreign troops from the West there?
Well, I think the likelihood is that there will be not quite, or not anything like such a visible Western military presence in Afghanistan after 2014. But I think the likelihood, and in my view, the desirable option will be for the Americans to have in place sufficient air assets to back up the Afghan national forces, both fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, and also drones, as well as special forces and intelligence networks. I think without those resources supporting the Afghan forces, I think it's very hard to see how the Afghans will be able to maintain any form of front against the Taliban, particularly in the tougher areas in the south and in the east. We've already seen many Afghan soldiers, many of whom fight extremely valiantly, extremely courageously. We've seen very many killed in the last few months, far more than any Western forces, and that's why we've still got a significant Western presence in Afghanistan. We also see very large numbers deserting. They don't really have anything much to fight for. They won't have much to fight for once the West have left, and they're left with what currently is anyway a corrupt government which doesn't really command their loyalty. So I think without the backup of certain US assets that I've mentioned, I think it will be very hard for them to withstand an insurgency of the power that remains. I think we've seen already in Iraq the effects of complete US military withdrawal. We've seen a massive resurgence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would not have happened, in my opinion, certainly not to the same extent, had there been left in place elements of US forces and US military operating techniques among the Iraqi forces. I think it would be, we would probably see something very similar happening in Afghanistan. And of course, it's not just to back up the Afghan forces, it's also to ultimately to protect the government in Kabul, to prevent Kabul falling, which could be a real possibility. And indeed, perhaps most importantly from the West's selfish point of view, to interdict any terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda or other extremist groups that formed up in Afghanistan, attempting to plan and set up a base comparable to the base which launched 9/11.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing whether British Prime Minister David Cameron was right to declare mission accomplished in Afghanistan. With me in the studio are Professor Anatol Lieven, who is from the War Studies Department of King's College London and is author of the book Pakistan, A Hard Country, and Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed from the Oxford University Centre for International Studies. And on the line we have Colonel Richard Kemp, who was commander of British troops in Afghanistan in 2003 and is now a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and in Afghanistan, Daoud Sultanzoy, a former member of the Afghan parliament and a presidential candidate at next year's elections. Professor Anatol Lieven, is the American administration linking a military presence to funding for the Afghan government, and is that fair?
Well, it's not doing so formally, but there have been, very, very heavy hints and off-the-record statements that, understandably, I mean, if Afghanistan, if the Afghan government does not want a continuation of, a US presence, well, why should the US go on supporting the Afghan state to this extent? But I agree with the Colonel. If this does lead to a complete withdrawal of US forces and US aid, then the result will be collapse. And I'm not so worried about Taliban victory, capturing Kabul, conquering the whole country. I don't think that's possible because of the regional power balance and the balance within Afghanistan. But, another aspect is that, as happened after all in 92 with the army that the Soviet Union left behind, if the Afghan National Army is not paid, it will go home with its weapons, it will break up again into militia groups. Here one's talking about not just one civil war, one's talking potentially about multiple civil wars. Yes, we have created this Afghan state. It depends overwhelmingly on us. There are two dangers. One is complete collapse. The other is that India will step in to a considerable extent to replace us. Now, it can't possibly do so to the same level, and that this will then encourage the Pakistanis to pursue still further their support for the Taliban. Then you have the prospect of a civil war with no foreseeable end in sight in Afghanistan. I mean, it's the 90s, but without the prospect of a Taliban victory. And then, I mean, I don't fear that left purely to themselves that the Taliban will provide safe havens, bases for Al-Qaeda. Indeed, the ones I've talked to have said that, pushing out Al-Qaeda as part of a settlement would really not be a problem for them, because partly a great many Taliban people are very angry with Al-Qaeda because of the way that Al-Qaeda brought disaster on them in 2001. But on the other hand, if the Taliban are still fighting a civil war, then Al-Qaeda, with its international links, is useful to them. Not in a huge way, but in a modest way. And therefore, some degree of Al-Qaeda presence will undoubtedly continue. So, I mean, I would say, yes, that we also have an interest of our own in trying to support the Afghan state, while at the same time aiming at a peace settlement with the Taliban, which would exclude Al-Qaeda by agreement. The other thing, which I always have to say in a British context, because the Americans really are not concerned by this, is that, of course, far more people have been killed by heroin in Britain in recent years than have been killed by terrorism. Most of the heroin comes from Afghanistan. The heroin is grown largely in Taliban areas, but it's traded by people who are our supposed allies. Any peace settlement in Afghanistan should also aim at trying to do something about the heroin trade, because as long as the war continues, everyone will have an interest in growing and profiting from heroin in order to support their troops.
All right, well, an extremely complicated situation. I want to finish up by asking our guests to perform some of the most impossible futurology, if you like. There is a presidential election going to happen in Afghanistan next year, and I want to ask what will be the result of it, and indeed will it take place in a peaceful way? Ishtiaq Ahmed, what do you think?
Well, what I wish is that there should not be a repeat of 2009, because President Karzai was at Oxford Union last month. And I noticed very much that, he wants to go down in history as some kind of a legendary Afghan leader, and he is distancing himself from his past role, which was perceived or real, as a puppet of America. So that is why he comes up and challenges Americans. The lawyer Jirga is asking something, and he's still reluctant, to sign on the agreement. So I think in the run-up to the elections, one should expect that, he should not become a spoiler, the effort that he has been making. So if this is the case and elections produce some kind of a relatively legitimate leadership and government, then I think, prospects would be much brighter, for some kind of a reasonable path to peace, with a commitment by the international community, the American military presence for another decade. So if you've got security commitment from outside, if you've got economic commitment, which the international community, declared, at summits at Chicago and Tokyo and elsewhere, if you got India and Pakistan finding a common ground in Afghanistan, if you got the political process that has been on in Afghanistan for the past over a decade, so these are all very big ifs, and which is why the starting point which I made was that there are so many things which are still uncertain, and the reason you have so much uncertainty necessitates that whatever levels, local, regional and international commitments are needed, they should be, provided as such.
Colonel Richard Kemp, how do you see the elections unrolling next year?
Well, I think you prefaced your question with the point that it is an impossible thing to foresee. But I do believe that however the elections go, that the new government in Afghanistan will find itself in an extremely difficult situation where it loses increasing extent of its own territory, loses control of its own territory in Afghanistan, and is responsible for overseeing what I think will probably become an increasingly fierce insurgency fought between the Taliban and its own government forces. And its main challenge, apart from a plethora of political and diplomatic and economic challenges that we'll face, its main challenge, I think, will be to hold together the Afghan national forces in the face of this insurgency. And it'll be very difficult for it to do, particularly if the new government turns out to be as corrupt as the old one. And we only need to think back to Vietnam days, and I know history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but the Americans produced a very effective fighting force for South Vietnam, and as soon as they left, that fighting force collapsed the first time that they came under severe pressure, because they could not find it in themselves to be loyal to a deeply corrupt government. And I'm afraid, unless something almost miraculous happens, we will see the same situation occurring in Afghanistan.
Professor Anatol Lieven, the elections, will they happen? Will they be peaceful? Will they work?
Well, first, I'd just like to say in response to the Colonel's last remarks, if that's mission accomplished, I would hate to think what failure looks like. The elections will probably take place. There is some talk of Karzai postponing them, finding an excuse to put them off. I'm convinced that he will do his utmost to rig them in favour of a Pashtun candidate. The questions are, which Pashtun candidate? How much rigging will be necessary? Will it be so massive as to totally delegitimise the whole process? And will the losers essentially, look, let's be honest, be bought off with our money, amongst other things, in ways that will lead them to accept the results? If, and now I've added a new set of ifs, Tish Jacks, if all this, happens, then the state can stagger on, as long as it retains, once again, our support. And Colonel Kemp made a very good point earlier about the need for continued combat air support, which, is actually, at the moment, the plan is to withdraw that after next year, at which point, of course, the many Afghan National Army positions will be abandoned almost automatically if they're not supported. That is why I would also say to conclude that in the end it is also essential, however extremely difficult, to pursue peace talks with the Taliban. And I think that although, of course, these have to be Afghan talks, that is the only way, this has to be an Afghan settlement, I do think that the United States and Britain, to a degree, also have a responsibility to try to initiate this process, to get it started.
Well, Dawood Sultanzai, some quite gloomy prognoses here in London. What you're standing for election next year, what are you hoping to achieve?
Well, first of all, allow me to say that it's so unfortunate that the professor depicted it in such an accurate fashion. I'm a Pashtun and I'm a candidate. Mr. Abdullah, as a seemingly non-Pashtun candidate, his hands and Mr. Karzai's hands were in the pockets of the international community and the Afghan people for the past 12 years. So Karzai has more in common with Abdullah than he has with me. So I hope that the professor can read a more accurate picture of the situation. Mr. Karzai, rigging or not rigging, let's talk about the people. The people of Afghanistan do not want the continuation of the past 12 years. It's up to Mr. Karzai to show that he's really releasing his hands from the parachute that brought him to Bonn 12 years ago and leave a legacy. And it's up to the international community to make sure that they do not give us this lip service of saying, we do not interfere in your internal affairs, while they have thousands of troops in this country. They should fulfill their obligations, and they should not hold the umbrella over this government's head while they're perpetrating a rigged election and producing a rigged election. It's up to the international community and Mr. Karzai to produce a clean election, or as much as possible. Right now, the signs are not looking that way. There are red flags. The international community knows about it. The Election Commission, the Election Complaints Commission, and all the government apparatus are in place to produce an election that either Mr. Karzai or his choice or Mr. Abdullah will come and they will create a role reversal, where Mr. Karzai will become the opposition, and Mr. Abdullah will come and they'll still start divvying up all the gains that they've amassed in the past few years. The international community should not forget its obligation. They cannot just be bystanders in this election. They produced this government, and they need to clean it up before they leave a bigger mess.
All right, that was Dawood Sultanzai, who is standing for election in the elections in Afghanistan next year. We were also joined on the line by Colonel Richard Kemp, a former commander of British troops in Afghanistan in 2003 and now a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And in the studio we had Professor Anatol Lieven, who is from the War Studies Department of King's College London and author of the book Pakistan, A Hard Country, and Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, research associate at the Oxford University Centre for International Studies. Thank you all very much.
The international community was at the helm of the most corrupt government in the world and kept feeding it, and this government and this leadership has acted as a spoiled child of the international community and getting away with it.
All right, so a mixed picture there. Colonel Richard Kemp, I want to bring you in here. From a military point of view, is Cameron right that basic stability in Afghanistan has been achieved?
Can I just say I agree with almost every word that Dawood Sultanzai just said there. I think he's completely right, particularly about the level of corruption and the competence of the Afghan government and the indulgence that the West has made in it, and also about the continuously changing strategic goals and aims of the West. But in answer to your question, I believe militarily, our forces and other NATO
functioning institutions and improved conditions for women will prove sustainable after foreign troops pull out of the country next year. So, was Mr. Cameron right, or has the 12-year Western military occupation of Afghanistan instead failed to achieve its goals? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Professor Anatol Lieven of the War Studies Department at King's College London and author of the book Pakistan, A Hard Country. And on the line we have Colonel Richard Kemp, who was commander of British troops in Afghanistan in 2003 and is now a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and in Afghanistan, Dawood Sultanzai, a former member of the Afghan Parliament and a candidate for the presidency at next year's elections. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Dawood Sultanzai, I want to start with you. What's the view in Afghanistan of Mr. Cameron's declaration of mission accomplished?
Well,
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Earlier this month, Prime Minister David Cameron said it was mission accomplished in Afghanistan and told troops there that they could return home with their heads held high. He said the task had been to create a basic level of security to prevent the country from becoming a haven for terror. But his comments have been greeted with scepticism. Al-Qaeda has long been vanquished in Afghanistan, but its most important area of activity is now further west, in Syria, Iraq and parts of Africa. Meanwhile, the Taliban remains a redoubtable force, opium production has flourished, and it's not yet clear whether any achievements in security, as well as in the drive to install democracy...
Forces in Afghanistan have made some very major achievements. They have killed a large number of extremists who certainly threatened the stability of Afghanistan, and in many cases would undoubtedly have gone on to threaten terrorist attacks against the West and around the world. I have no doubt whatever about that. And by stopping so many of them, I think that they have helped to protect the Western world, as well as, to an extent, Afghanistan. I also think that they've been successful in preventing Afghanistan again from becoming a base for terrorism from which the West can be threatened. And I recognize that does not mean that Afghanistan has been and is now a secure country which enjoys any measure of peace. But it has achieved that objective, which I think was the overwhelming objective.
We understand the political need for the consumption of this kind of a statement. Naturally, you can see a glass half full or half empty. But the problem with Afghanistan's endeavor, the international community's involvement in Afghanistan, is that from the very beginning, from the Bonn process, everything started on a reactive mode. And the international community, including Britain and the United States, never became proactive regarding Afghanistan. And we always patched things as we went. Our goals shifted, our strategies shifted. We never held the Afghan government responsible. We never held them accountable. While on one hand, we wanted to say that Afghanistan is a free country and the government has to find its own way. On the other hand,